In 2014, I was 26 years old. My wife, Leah, and I had been married 3 years when we had our first child, a girl we named Marie. Marie was the joy of our life. It's impossible to explain the joy and fears that come with being a new parent. We read all the new parenting books and took all the advice we possibly could from friends and family. Yes, we were the typical overly obsessed new parents. At 4 months old, Marie became ill. At first, it was just a low-grade fever and vomiting, so we scheduled an appointment for Marie to see the pediatrician the next day. But later that night, we were terrified to see Marie had a rash over most of her body, and her fever had spiked to over 104 degrees. She was lethargic and would barely move or make a sound. We immediately bundled her up and sped to the hospital, where we would later discover Marie had contracted the rotavirus, a fairly common but quite serious virus that has a 35% mortality rate among infants. Seeing our little girl at 4 months old suffering like that, with an IV in her arm and constant vomiting and insanely high fever for almost 3 days, was the most traumatizing event we had ever experienced as a new parent. Marie recovered after a few days in the hospital, and while still weak and recovering, she was released. Leah and I were exhausted, emotionally and physically, from the experience and couldn't wait to get our little girl home so we could all return to normal life again. The hospital was about 30 minutes from our home, so we got Marie secured in the car and headed out, getting onto the highway. My wife gets motion sickness, so it was common for her to do the driving. For some reason, the effects of motion sickness were less for her if she drove, or at least that's the reason she was often giving me. It is possible my wife disliked my driving. I sat in the back seat with Marie to watch over her. It was midsummer, so even though it was 4 p.m., it was still very hot. The AC in our vehicle didn't work well, so having the windows down, at least for me, was normal. Off in the distance, in the direction we were headed, I could see a heavy storm was approaching, so I knew I only had a few minutes of fresh air before needing to close the window. I sat in the back seat with Marie to watch over her. It was midsummer, so even though it was 4 p.m., it was still very hot. The AC in our vehicle didn't work well, so having the windows down, at least for me, was normal. Off in the distance, in the direction we were headed, I could see a heavy storm was approaching, so I knew I only had a few minutes of fresh air before needing to close the window. Suddenly, Leah shouted, "What's wrong with this guy?" I turned behind me to see a man in a pickup truck tailgating us so closely, it looked like he was going to hit us. He would swerve back and forth in and out of his lane as though he was going to try to pass us, but we were on the busy highway, so each time he swerved, he almost collided with the oncoming traffic. Each time this happened, he seemed to get more and more aggressive. At times, his tires smoked and squealed. Each time he returned to our lane, he would speed up, flash his lights, and tailgate us, honking his horn and driving erratically. It became immediately apparent to both Leah and I that either this man was insane or he was driving intoxicated. The traffic in the opposite lane finally cleared enough so that the man could speed past us, and as he did, he let out a dozen or so curse words, flipping us off, but instead of passing us, he stayed parallel to us, and having seen me in the back window, trailed back to curse at me. He could barely keep his truck in the lane, swerving in and out closer to our car, cursing and flipping me off. His windows were down, as were mine, so hearing him was no issue. Then, without warning, the man reached down into his seat and came back up with a full bottle of beer. He obviously just picked it up from a six-pack. Before I could realize what he was going to do, he threw the bottle with all his might directly into my window. It struck me hard on the side of the head. The man then sped by and left. My wife didn't even know exactly what had happened, but to be honest, I can't recall exactly what she was saying because the impact had me going in and out of consciousness. I remember being able to say, "He's gone. Let's just get home." I woke to my wife shaking me and shouting, "Are you all right? Oh my God, are you all right?" We had arrived at our home and were in the garage. She had opened my door and could now see the huge bump on my head and that it was slightly bleeding. I could see the horror on her face, so I immediately played it down, telling her, "Yeah, That crazy SOB threw a beer bottle at me. I'm fine, let's get Marie inside. Needless to say, the entire evening my wife was insisting on taking me to the hospital, and the entire evening I was insisting that I was fine and it's just a nasty bump. Later that night, she relented, and being completely exhausted, her and Marie fell asleep. I, however, was not okay. The pain was unbearable, but even more unbearable was the thought of waking my exhausted wife and baby girl so that we could go back to the hospital. No way. I found a bottle of Tylenol and took a few more than I should have. I was still dizzy and nauseous, and knew I probably had a mild concussion. I also knew that with a concussion you are not supposed to sleep immediately, but I was completely exhausted. So I laid down next to my wife and daughter, and despite the incredible pain, quickly fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up. My head was still horribly pounding and the pain was still terrible, but the nausea was mostly gone as well as the dizziness. The clock said 3 a.m., an ugly old 1980s looking white plastic clock sitting on the nightstand. Where did this thing come from? I didn't remember us having a clock like this, but that was the least important thing on my mind. I needed water. I felt dehydrated and dying of thirst, so while squinting through the pain, I began making my way from the bedroom to the kitchen. I wanted to do so without waking my family, so I tried making my way without turning on the lights. It wasn't until I got to the kitchen that I realized something was very wrong. This was not our kitchen. For a moment I was stunned. Oh my God. Were we so exhausted and traumatized that we parked and entered the wrong home? Suddenly I was horrified. What if the inhabitants heard us and have a weapon or called the police? I was still somewhat stunned, not thinking clearly, so I stumbled toward what I thought was a large patio window. As I approached, however, I realized it was instead a missing door that was seemingly broken right off its hinges, revealing the backyard. I stood petrified, completely mesmerized by what I saw through that opening. Beyond the broken door was an empty yard overgrown by weeds. The yard had no fence or boundary. Instead, it extended out for hundreds of meters, leading to a massive industrial complex. The complex was glowing with fires and security lights of blues and reds that lit up the thick hazy skies above it, making the refinery appear far more monstrous than it might have been. I stared at it, allowing my mind to comprehend what I was seeing. Where were we? There are no industrial refineries for over 100 miles of where we live. We had driven the correct way home, or at least as far as I could remember, considering I had passed out in the car. A thought occurred to me. Maybe it's possible Leah, in her distress, had driven the wrong way. But how could she be so upset as to not only drive over an hour in the wrong direction, but also park and enter the wrong home? None of this made sense. I walked a few steps back to the kitchen and noticed the counters were covered in dust. Now I could see clearly in the moonlight that in fact most everything was covered in dust. It appeared that no one had lived here for a very long time. I looked down at the countertop, searching for any items that might help me identify the house or where we were. I noticed a large dark object on one of the counters. I couldn't quite make out the shape. Maybe a large glove? I reached out and grabbed it and screamed. The object writhed in my hands as I grabbed it. I instinctively started sweeping the walls with my hand, trying to connect with the light switch, and finally, with a click, flickering yellow light spilled into the kitchen. I stood staring at the object, and my mouth fell wide in disgust and horror. The object was no glove. It was a massive hairy spider, twice as large as a man's hand. It appeared to be in the throes of death, as it barely moved upside down on the counter. I let out a scream. Suddenly my head throbbed horribly and I became dizzy again. The dust faded away, the spider faded away, everything faded until it became my home again. I was standing in the middle of my kitchen with the lights on. Leah came running out, startled and concerned, and asked me what was wrong. After a few seconds, I composed myself and simply told her I had seen a big spider. She looked down at the floor a bit, as she did not care for spiders at all, and then said, "Come back to bed, you're worrying me." I lay in bed, realizing in complete confidence that vision was a hallucination brought on by my concussion. I was no doctor, but I had never experienced anything like that in my sleep before. I was literally conscious, walking in a hallucination. I started thinking maybe it could be more serious than a concussion. Maybe he fractured my skull and there was brain damage, but I didn't feel much pain anymore, and the dizziness and nausea were much less again. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning was Saturday, and we decided to stay in and relax, play board games, watch TV, and just recuperate from the previous day's insanity. The day was a joy. We played Scrabble and watched TV. All the while, Marie had improved considerably and giggled most of the time playing with her toys. It was a great, happy day. Evening came and we put Marie to bed, this time in her crib since she had improved so much. Leah and I chatted a bit, and after a while laid down to go to sleep. I woke again in the middle of the night. I was on the wrong side of the bed to see the clock, so I sat up enough to look over Leah, sleeping next to me, and have a look. The clock was gone. It took me a few seconds to remember the old 1980s clock wasn't real to start with. When I finally did remember, I breathed a sigh of relief. There was no dust, there were no spiders. I was in my home in bed with my wife. I laid back down on my pillow and turned toward my beautiful wife's face to look at her before trying to fall back to sleep. Then I froze and felt as though my heart literally stopped. My wife's eyes were wide open, single tears of black streaming from both of them. Her mouth was wide open, and I could tell she was not breathing. I screamed and stammered out of bed, falling to the floor with a hard thud. I then sprang to my feet, calling out, "Leah, Leah!" I began shaking her wildly on the bed, trying to wake her, and it was then, in the moonlight, that I could see her eyes clearly. They were nearly black in the dim light, but not black, deep red, the same color as the tears streaming from them, and now her mouth, but not tears, blood. I screamed with such force and pain that the sound only made the terrifying situation that much worse. I stumbled away from my dead wife and the horrific image, and suddenly thought of Marie. No, God no. My heart suddenly sprang back to life and beat so hard I could hear it in my head. Slowly I made my way out of the bedroom to my daughter's room. I looked in half petrified. I could see her crib and that the ceiling fan was on, causing the thin white curtains at her window to gently sway. But there was something about the sight. She was too quiet, too still. I found I could barely move or breathe. The dizziness and head throbbing returned, and then the nausea came. I vomited in the hall outside Marie's room and had to get out. I moved without thought. I was in shock, but somehow made it to the front door that led outside to the yard and driveway. I would call for help, somebody help, but when I stepped outside, the nightmare was there. Laying in the street was a woman and her dog. Their eyes and mouths were open, blood streaming from them. Across the street from them, a car had struck a tree. Smoke and grinding noise came from the vehicle. The headlights shined, illuminating the length of the lifeless street. The man's eyes were opened, as was his mouth. Red poured from them. It was then that I noticed the moon. It was orange, blood orange, and snow was beginning to fall. Snow in the summer, but the snow was not white. It was orange. It fell gently and silently. Looking up at it, it tickled my face and covered my eyes. Then I noticed a gurgling sound in my ears and felt fluid pour from my nose and my mouth and realized I could not see. It was happening. It was happening to me, and I was so thankful not to be spared. Dawn had come. It must have been about 6 a.m. No woman was dead in the street with her dog. No man was crashed into a tree. I stood and rushed into the house, my heart pounding even harder than before. Please, God, I thought, please. I barely took 5 steps through the front door before I heard, "Wow, you're up early." It was Leah, alive, and there beside her, in the stroller, was Marie, angry and whiny. "Our daughter woke me up early today, starving." I did not speak. I could not speak. Leah asked me if I was okay. I told her I was and that I needed a shower to wake myself up. That was the last episode I had. My head no longer throbbed. I had no further dizziness or nausea. Time went on and I never mentioned the visions I had. If I had mentioned them, Leah would have completely lost it. She doesn't even like it when I watch horror movies. I kept the visions to myself, and every day I prayed. I had no idea if there was a God, but I prayed. Please, God, let the visions have been a result of my head injury and not some ghastly premonition of the future.